Hey guys, it's Alex, and today I'm here, finally, with my July reading wrap-up. I read 15 books in the month of July, and even though August is nearly over, I have not yet discussed any of them. As always, links to any other videos or relevant channels will be posted down below, so definitely go check them out. I also don't have most of these books anymore, because a lot of them were library books that have since been returned. The first book I finished was Along for the Ride by Sarah Dessen, which I finished on the 1st. This was mostly a book that I read in June because I was listening to the audiobook, and I gave this 3 stars. This is a YA contemporary romance about Auden, who's staying with her father and his new wife over the summer, and starts to get out of her very sheltered, academic-focused shell. I did enjoy this book. I enjoy most of Sarah Dessen's book, especially her sort of middle years ones, but this one just didn't quite make it 4 stars for me. I think a lot of the time for her books, I'm on the line between 3 and 4 stars, and this one was just kind of a little bit less than some of the others. I still think it's a fine YA contemporary. I just don't think it's quite as well done in a lot of regards as some of the others, but if you like YA contemporary romance, this is still one that I definitely recommend picking up. It's fun and sweet, and it deals a lot with girl hate and kind of the not like other girls trope, because at the beginning of the novel, Auden kind of falls into that a lot, and then character development happens, which I appreciated. I don't think this one was quite 4 stars for me, but I would still definitely recommend picking it up if it sounds like your kind of thing. The second book I read was The Serpent King by Jeff Zentner. This was recommended to me by Linda's World of Books. This is another YA contemporary novel about 3 friends. One is the son of a preacher who has gone to prison. One is a girl who runs a popular fashion blog who really wants to get out of the town, and the third is a boy who's obsessed with a popular fantasy series. They're 3 outcasts who deal with their lives in the small town and deal with prejudice, and while I had a lot of small issues with this book, overall it made me cry a lot. It made me cry for a long time. I thought some of the writing was a little cheap, and I thought some of the characters were not entirely well written, but overall, I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's one I would definitely recommend if you're looking for a nice cry, because I cried for a good long while. That made me cry a lot harder than most books do. So I think at the end of the day, I gave it the benefit of the doubt and thoroughly enjoyed it. So check it out if you're interested. The next book that I read in July was Dead Wake by Erik Larson. I buddy read this with cozy reader Kelly. This is a nonfiction book that centers around the sinking of the Lusitania. I gave this 4 stars. I think Kelly gave it 3, although we had, in general, the same opinions about this book, I think. I just enjoyed it more. Erik Larson is a fantastic researcher, and it shows. This book has so many details about everything. Like, genuinely, everything he could find is just thrown into this book. And I think it's wonderful for that, but I also think that does slow it down a bit. And with these books, it can be easy to, like, get bogged down in the details, but I still really enjoyed it. I learned a lot from this book that I didn't know, because I think in school it was kind of implied that the sinking of the Lusitania had a lot to do with the US entering the war, but we didn't actually enter the war until much later, and it wasn't really about the sinking of the Lusitania at all, so that was interesting. I learned a lot from this book, and I think it's really worthwhile, and that in general, Erik Larson is a wonderful nonfiction writer. This is my second of his books that I've completed, and I definitely plan to make my way through his work. Then I started rereading one of my old favorite series, which is the Protector of the Small series by Tamora Pierce, and first I read First Test. I rated this 5 stars and absolutely loved it. This tells the story of Caladria of Mendelin, who decides she wants to become a knight. In this world, this is set after the Alana books, where Alana has pretended to be a boy in order to become a knight, so now it's legal for girls to become knights, but Caladria is the first one. This book specifically deals with her first year, as she's a probationary page, which means she's not a full page like the boys are, she's probationary, because at the end of the year it's going to be decided if she can keep up with the guys. I love this. I remember as a kid when I read the Tamora Pierce books that this series wasn't quite one of my favorites, but I think that has changed. I think this is my favorite series in the Tortell universe, because it was so wonderful. It was so nice and charming, and it dealt with sexism so well, and in a much more visceral way than a lot of Tamora Pierce's other books. Kel is a wonderful character. She's not trying to be the first girl who does anything. She's not a hero or anything like Alana was in the first series in this world. Kel is just a normal kid who wants to be a knight and serve the realm, like all her older brothers did. She's just a normal kid, and I think that's why I love these books so much. I think they're just wonderful, and this first one was so well done. And then I read the second one, Page, which covers her second, third, and fourth years being a page. I gave this one 4 stars, and while I did enjoy it quite a bit, like 4 stars is not a nothing rating, I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I just think it had some pacing issues that the first one didn't have. It does take place over 3 more years than the first one, and it's not that much longer, and I think at points it was just a little bit too much. It felt like we were kind of getting a summary of events sometimes instead of like actually seeing her life. But in general, all my same thoughts as the first book. Then I read Betrayal at Little Gibraltar by William Walker, which is a non-fiction World War I book about the Meuse-Argonne offensive. I opted not to rate this book because it definitely wasn't written for me, which I knew going in. I didn't enjoy it, but I learned a lot from it, and that was kind of my goal. It's a very heavy military history. It's very dense. It was difficult for me to get through, and it took me quite a while to read it. And every time I read it, I kind of had to force myself to pick it up. But I don't like military histories, and I was intentionally trying to push myself out of my comfort zone. So I was quite pleased that I read the whole thing, and I do think I gained a lot from it. I know very little about World War I, and I'd never even heard of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. So I think reading it was an incredibly valuable experience, and I definitely want to continue reading more books about World War I, just because I think it's an important topic that gets glossed over a lot in school, and I don't know very much about it, hence the 2 World War I nonfiction books I read this month. But I think if you're interested in military history, it might be worthwhile for you to check it out. I really don't know. A lot of it went over my head, but I also learned a lot. So I'm counting that book as a win, even though I'm not rating it and I didn't exactly enjoy it. Then I returned to something a little bit easier and read Squire by Tamora, which is the 3rd book in the Protector of the Small Quartet. I gave this book 5 stars. This covers Kel's time as a squire. I adored this book. This is my favorite of the series, which is kind of evident by the fact that it's falling apart and torn up and literally held together by tape. I just had to tape the cover back on the other day, but this book is wonderful. This book is everything I remembered it being from my childhood. I read this book so many times. It's just, I think it's the best of the series. It has the most depth. It has the most scope. It covers 4 years, but because it's so much longer than the first 2 books, it doesn't have those same pacing issues. It's wonderful. If you like young adult fantasy or even middle grade fantasy, I definitely recommend this series. It makes me so happy. It deals with feminism really well, which I keep saying, but I adore it. And I finished off the series with Lady Knight. I gave this book 4 stars, and I will admit this one disappointed me a little bit. This covers Kel's time as a knight. It covers about a year, I think, of time, maybe a little bit less. And I think that was kind of why I didn't enjoy it as much. I expected this to be another 5-star read, but it just fell short a little bit. I think it was too slow for me, which is strange to say because I normally really enjoy slow books. But I did find myself getting a little bit bored at points. It wasn't bad. I still really enjoyed it. I still love this book. But there were some points in this book where I was very bored and it kind of felt like I was slogging through a little bit until I got to something interesting. And I think it is because the other books cover so much time or are short enough. It doesn't cover all the details of everyday life. Whereas this one really does. And you get to see a lot of Kel planning and on the road and leading a camp of refugees. And it's just not entirely interesting at every point, but that was sort of like towards the middle portion of this book, and then it got very interesting and I thoroughly enjoyed it, so I still recommend. I think this book was just like a little bit for me compared to the others, but still wonderful. I think Kel is probably Tamora Pierce's best character. She has this strength about her that I think is really wonderful, that she doesn't always see in herself, and over the course of the books she comes to see it because she's a realistic person. She just didn't recognize that she could be kind of different. She just saw herself as an ordinary person, just like her older brothers who became knights. And she learns that she has a different skill set, and she learns how to use that skill set, and she's trained for it. And I really appreciated that, and I think it's just a wonderful series. And then I finally finished Aniara by Harry Martinson. This is a 1950s science fiction poem that I had been reading for about a month. It's actually where we got the name for my cat. This covers a spaceship full of people who were escaping from Earth as it was being destroyed, who get blown off course. They wind up being stuck in space and just drifting aimlessly for the rest of their lives. They find solace in an AI called the Mima, which gives them hope for survival. It shows them other people, other worlds. It shows them existence in general, and they wind up treating the Mima like a god. I gave this 3 stars. I do think I struggled with the fact that it was a poem and a translated science fiction poem and potentially a poorly translated science fiction poem that I read online. The first 29 stanzas were quite wonderful that I would recommend reading. After that, it lost it for me and I had an incredibly hard time following the rest of the story, but it's still one that I think if it sounds interesting, if you like sci-fi like that, I feel like checking out this poem might be very interesting. My boyfriend absolutely adores it, and I kind of wish I'd gotten more out of it than I did, but I was just so lost for like 70% of this poem that I really didn't enjoy it as much as I wanted to. But the parts I understood and enjoyed were wonderful. It was just everything else was kind of meh. But I'm glad I read it. I'm glad I pushed myself out of my comfort zone in order to read it. It just wasn't exactly for me. Not really a good place to start with reading poetry, I think. Just like pushing myself out of my comfort zone in every possible way. But I do feel accomplished that I read it. And then I read The Gilded Razor by Sam Lansky. This is a memoir about Sam Lansky's time as a teenager being addicted to drugs. I gave this 2 stars, and I did film a review for this, but this was one of those books that I almost didn't film a review for just because I thought it would be so mean. I thought I would just be too mean to film a review for it because I really didn't like this book. If you've ever read those tweets from that guy in your MFA that are just like making fun of the very pretentious cishet white guy in your MFA, I feel like you understand what this book is. If you're familiar with those memes, this is essentially just an entire book of that. Only it was sincere. And it was a very rough read. I've never experienced someone complaining about being middle class quite so much, and like not complaining while being middle class, specifically complaining about being middle class. He was complaining that his father went to Berkeley, and I was like, this is not a problem in your life. But it was a rough read. I really don't recommend it. It didn't feel like he was reflecting on himself and his problems at the time. He was more just like doing the bare minimum, and he still sounded kind of pleased with himself for having had so many problems. He sounded like he felt special for his drug addiction being so bad, and I wasn't interested in him or his life. And it was one of those nonfiction books where I left it just feeling like I cringed a lot while reading it. And then I read Love, Hate, and Other Filters by Samira Ahmed. This is young adult contemporary about a Muslim girl who is torn between her parents' traditional Indian culture and American culture. The first half of the book is very much a contemporary romance, and then at the halfway point, a hate crime happens in a city a few hundred miles away, and the main character experiences the fallout from that. I gave this book 3 stars. I think the first half, I just really didn't care so much for the story. I don't like cute, fluffy romances very much. They're just kind of mediocre to me, and the first part of the story was fine. The second part, I was much more interested, but I also started to see more flaws within the author's writing. Like, the story on a whole was fine. I think I would recommend it maybe to younger teens, like 14, 15. I don't think it's one that translates quite as well to adults. There were some issues with characters being kind of flat, especially a lot of the side characters. And the main character was a lot more concerned with her romance than the possibility of her parents disowning her. And I'm glad I read it. I think it was an interesting book, and I think it definitely had a lot of good points, but at the end of the day, it was just kind of mediocre for me. Then I read Ribbons by Laurence Yep, which I gave 5 stars. This was a reread for me. I've reread this book so many times. It's a middle grade book about a Chinese-American girl whose parents are bringing her Chinese grandmother over from Hong Kong. She has to quit ballet because her parents can no longer afford to send her there, and the rest of the book deals with her missing ballet and also getting to know her Chinese grandmother who she's never met before, and she has a lot of cultural differences from her grandmother, and I think it's really wonderfully done. This always makes me cry. I give it 5 stars. I've read it so many times. I adore it. It's one of my favorites, and it's one of those middle grade books that if you like middle grade contemporaries, if you like contemporaries that deal with a little bit more issue-driven stuff, I highly recommend this because it's so wonderful. And there's just something about ballet that makes me cry. I don't know what it is because this isn't a particularly sad book. Like, yes, her quitting ballet is sad. It's just the way it's written feels so small and so down to earth and so real that it always hits me emotionally. And the relationship with her grandmother, I think, is beautifully done. Because her grandmother is not a terrible person, but they don't get along for a great many reasons. And I highly recommend this book. It's one of my all-time favorites, and I will probably reread it many, many more times. Then I read Under the Banner of Heaven by John Krakauer for Cammie's Corner and Joni Reed's Crime Scene Read-Along. This is a nonfiction book about Mormon fundamentalism, and specifically within that, two brothers who killed their sister-in-law and her infant daughter. I gave this book 4 stars. I think it was very interesting. I think it was very well researched and well done. I learned a lot about Mormonism and Mormon fundamentalism that I didn't previously know, and John Krakauer is a wonderful writer. He's one of my favorite nonfiction authors. I think it was an interesting take on not just specifically Mormon fundamentalism, but how fundamentalism comes to exist in religions. How people become fringe when most religions are fairly mainstream and have fairly normal beliefs. If you're someone who's interested in religion, interested in Mormonism, or just likes true crime, I think it could be very interesting and worthwhile. It's a lot about the history of the religion, which I didn't expect going in, and I do think that's why it was 4 stars instead of 5 for me. I just personally wasn't super interested in the history of Mormonism, but it was still very worthwhile, and I learned a lot, and John Krakauer is wonderful. I really love all of his books. And then for the Literary Alliance book club on Facebook, I read The Great Alone by Kristin Hannah, which has gotten so much hype, but I only gave it 3 stars, and I was kind of disappointed by that. This is a historical fiction book about a family who moves to Alaska. The father is abusive, and it covers their years in Alaska as they learn how to live in the wilderness and learn how to take care of themselves, and eventually have to deal with the father's abuse escalating. I think the writing flowed well, and I was interested in the story from start to finish, but there were just so many problems that irritated me in the book. There was a very unhealthy relationship that was treated as though it was healthy, and it kind of had that issue where the book felt like it was both too slow and too fast. I really like slow books, but it felt like it was too slow on the wrong parts and too fast on the parts that should have been slower. When it came to character development and change and growth, it felt like it skipped over those bits very quickly, and everything else was just very long and drawn out. And I have a full review on this coming very soon where I explain my thoughts a lot better since it's been a month since I finished this book. But I was disappointed. I'm still down to read more Kristin Hannah to try and see, but this was not a book that I particularly enjoyed. And the final book I read in July is potentially from my favorite series of all time, and that is The President's Daughter by Ellen Emerson White. I, of course, gave this 5 stars. This is about a girl named Meg whose mother becomes the President of the United States. This book covers her as her mother decides to run for president, gets nominated, goes through the election, and becomes president, and Meg starts to adjust to life in the White House. The only real issue I have with this book is that it does cover a lot of time in not a very long book, and I do think that creates kind of a pacing issue. There's so much more I would like to be explored, but I love it. I love this book so much. I love this series so much. This is my least favorite book in the series, and I still give it 5 stars, which should tell you how much I love this series. Meg is a wonderful character. She's highly intelligent, highly capable. She's very funny in a sarcastic, snarky way, and it's really great to read. She has a wonderful relationship with her family. If you're interested in YA contemporaries that focus a lot on family relationships, I think this is a good one to try out because they have their problems, they have difficulties, but at the end of the day, they are a loving family. And they often show love for each other by bickering a lot and teasing each other, and it's wonderful. This book is kind of heartwarming where the others get kind of a little bit more tragic as things happen and they're a lot more emotional, but this one is just lovely and nice, and it makes me so happy. No one ever seems to talk about this series, but it's my absolute favorite. I love it so much. There will be definitely more on these books to come because I want to talk about them in depth so that people might actually pick them up. But I love them. I love them so much. I love White's writing style. I love everything about these books. And just highly, highly recommend. This has been a very long and rambly video, so kudos to you if you made it all the way to the end. Let me know down below if you've read any of these books or have any thoughts about them. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.